Thank you very much. So this is our agenda today. We're first going to talk about what crowdsourcing is, then how it used to be done back in the bad old days. Then we'll talk a little bit about leveraging the crowd. I'll give you an example from the training industry because there's not a whole lot of data on the financial impact of leveraging the crowd in succession and performance. And then we'll also talk about a few examples of how it can be done cheaply now. So first off, what is crowdsourcing? I presume you can all read? So crowdsourcing is essentially distributed data gathering and problem solving model. Now, my examples here are fairly simple. So you think of Amazon.com. Technically, that's crowdsourcing. So think of it, when you go to buy something from Amazon or any one of these online sites, you put as much weight, if not more weight, into the reviews from people you don't even know than the actual product descriptions. That's what the research shows. That is the crowd. The same thing in Wikipedia. How many people have been out to a Wikipedia site to gather some information in the last 30 days? Again, people you don't know, and generally speaking, the content is pretty good. So the power of the crowd is enormous. Now, let me give you an example of how we used to leverage the crowd back in the old days. As was previously mentioned, I'm a former Air Force pilot, and this is one of the planes that I flew. That's not me, actually. That's just kind of a stock photo. But in order to fly this plane, I had to get a top secret security clearance. And the process is, I'm the candidate, right, for this clearance. I'm the guy in blue. And they made me give names of references, right, standard stuff. And I did. And I checked in with my references about a week later. And they said, oh, yeah, we've all talked to the investigator. OK, OK. About 6 weeks later, I'd still not heard anything back about whether or not I was getting my top secret clearance. And as it happens, I was home for the weekend. And as a just coincidence, my father worked for the US Department of Defense. And one of his jobs, I think he did it for about 2 years, was to do these investigations. So he was an investigator doing the same thing that was being done to me. And he didn't talk about his work at home. But I asked him, I said, so Dad, well, and the reason I asked the question, it was 6 weeks later, and I had a bit of a checkered past, to be fair. So I was afraid something, kind of dodgy might have come up. And I said, well, why is it taking so long? And he said, these people, these 3 people that you gave, investigators don't give a darn what they have to say. In fact, the process was, he said, we'd interview these people for an hour. The first 55 minutes was simply to build trust and rapport, to tee up the last 5 minutes of the interview. And in that last 5 minutes, the investigator asked the question, who else knows Paul and can tell me a little bit about Paul? And that leads to this next round. And he said, this is where you find out about people. Because obviously, the first ring of references that you give are going to say good things. That's why we don't care. It's this next ring. And he said, the point is, everybody has dirt. Everybody. We just need to find it. Because that helps us better determine whether or not you deserve this security clearance. You, sir, have dirt. You didn't shower on Saturday, and you know it. You over there, that thing last month, okay, out of public decency, I'm not going to describe it, okay? But you all know you have dirt, and you have to find out. Now, in the recruiting situation, as opposed to, pardon me, security clearances, the reason you want to find out dirt, not only to find out if somebody's appropriate for the position, but when the person comes into the organization, you need to know those weaknesses so you can support them in the first few critical months. So that was how it was done in the old days. Very, very expensive. It took 6 weeks. And a person making phone calls, dialing a phone back when they actually dialed, and then go out in your car and sit down and meet with people. And my dad said that typically there was another ring beyond this, which I didn't depict here because I think PowerPoint charges by the dot. But they said, he would go as far as he had to go. So very, very expensive back in the day. And later on, we're going to talk about how you can do it for next to nothing these days. So the next, I'd like to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the power of the crowd from a training example. Now, like I mentioned before, there's not a whole lot of research on leveraging the crowd for performance and succession planning, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. But there's a wonderful example right here in your own backyard in an organization called Transport for London. And I got to tell you, this is the first time I've given this example here, and I'm really looking forward to it, because in America, when I use this example, I have to explain to people what buses and trains are, because they just have no concept. So I'm going to assume that you all know what buses and trains are. So anyway, Transport for London was facing a problem about absenteeism. And through their research, they found that part of the problem of their absenteeism was stress. Okay, the workers are stressed. Now, I've spent a good bit of time on the tube, and I know how stressful it is to ride on one of those things. So it must be even a heck of a lot tougher to work there to deal with people like me who are stressed out on the tube. So what they did was what was a fairly simple intervention. I think it was a 1 hour, I've taken the course, it was a 1 hour course. And what they found, and they did the testing before and after, and what they found was they reduced absenteeism by 1 day per worker. But then when you notice how many workers there are here, sorry I'm in your way, that totals up to almost 8 million quid. Now, some of the times people will say, well, wait a minute, were there intervening variables and so on and so forth? And yeah, that's always possible. But this was all done pre-London Olympic Games and so on and so forth, so they really teased out for most of that. And the point is that you can get incredible leverage from moving the needle just this much in a large crowd. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 examples. Am I doing okay on time, boss? Good. I'm going to give you 3 examples of crowdsourcing. The first 2 are going to be internal. The third one is going to be external. Now, again, these are just to get your thoughts flowing. There's not a whole lot we can do in 20 minutes. But they're inexpensive ways that you can put in practice today. All right, the first one is email. I assume it's a technology most of you have heard of. All right, so here's my example, and I've actually done this. This says, you know, Whitbread. It wasn't Whitbread that I did this with, but a simple process. You put in an email address. This one says growth. You can name it whatever you want, at whitbread.com. And then the subject line is the name of the employee that you want to give feedback for. And then you just type in, you know, Lindsay did a great job. So you can have your network guys write a real simple script that takes this content and parses it into either just a straight up SQL database or your talent software. Now, what data points does this contain? It contains the person who's giving the feedback, that's the person who sent the email, the subject, so the person whose performance is being rated here, and then the topic, as well as the date. That's a huge amount of data once you aggregate it. If you think about it, in a 20,000 person company, 3 or 4 of these emails a year, that's a huge amount of data, and it takes no time at all. A couple of key points here that you're going to see in all these examples. One is you're going to the crowd. A lot of solutions or concepts that you'll hear are being pitched that you have to get the crowd to come to you. Only 5 or 10% of the crowd is going to come to you. It can still be valuable, but if you go to where the crowd is, you'll get a lot more content and a lot bigger impact. And by going to where the crowd is, that's their email. They are there every single day. And you're making it super easy for people to give the feedback, and it costs almost next to nothing. Okay, the next example is social software. And by social enterprise software, I'm talking about Yammer, Salesforce Chatter, any kind of internal blog. So just a curiosity, show of hands, how many of you organizations have or use internal social blogging type software? Out of curiosity, okay. So that's a lot. It's actually more than I expected. So here's an example, and this is actually a screenshot from actual people, real people, live people that I've worked with in the past. And if you look through this content, this is performance. This is performance content. People typically don't think of it that way because they think it's communication or knowledge sharing or something like that. But here, clearly, we talk about, Esther's talking about somebody who got the awards, and then down here, Martin, who I actually just ran into downstairs, talked about an accomplishment. It's a vast amount of data because this stuff is just streaming along every day. And again, you know who posted it, that's the data point, and you have the content. Again, just reiterating, the content is in the cloud being provided by the crowd, and all you have to do is harness it. Okay, so my last example here is more of an external, this is really steered, those first two are more towards performance. This one is a bit more about succession and onboarding, induction. So in this example, there's your candidate, and there are the 3 references. You're going to hire somebody into this position. Again, don't really care about those 3 candidates. What we want is we want to get at these people. LinkedIn. You have access to all these people via LinkedIn. My old man had to drive around for 6 weeks to get access to these people, but you can do it in 1 hour's worth of desk work. Now, when I oftentimes talk about this, somebody will immediately push back and say, well, wait a minute. It's one thing for the US Department of Defense to go out there and talk to other people who know your references, because it's no secret that you're applying for a top secret security clearance, which is a little ironic, I suppose. But when you talk about a candidate for a job, they may not want you, or you shouldn't be talking to those people, because the fact that they're a candidate for a job is, is private. I say, okay, well, here's what you do. Once you get these names on the outside, go back to the candidate and say, can I talk to him? Is it okay if I talk to these people? 1 of 2 things happens. It's like clockwork. This scenario, where they say, yeah, you can talk to these 6, but this one, that's my boss, my current boss. Okay, so please don't talk to them. Or maybe this person, they had a falling out with that person, or this person is a gossip or something. It happens, right? There's always going to be 1 or 2 that's crossed off the list. This is a different matter. Because if you go to the candidate and say, can I talk to these people, and they line through 80% of them, you can consider that a red flag, or at the very least, a big yellow one. So within that desk work, 1 hour, throwing out some names and getting feedback, you develop a tremendous amount of information. And through this process, again, using the free software that's out there that you're already using, the cloud already exists, the crowd is already there, just leverage it, you can have a tremendous impact. Okay, so that's the end of that. We talked about what crowdsourcing is. We talked about how expensive it used to be done and why it didn't used to be done. I mean, the US Department of Defense did it because they could spend a boatload of money. Companies didn't do it that way in the old days. We talked about a couple of examples of how you can do it internally now and how you can do it externally very cheap, and everybody can do it, not just the US government that wastes money. So that's the end of my comments, and I think I'll turn it back to Brendan.
Thanks very much, Paul.